The Heinemann Podcast is a production of Heinemann Publishing. Heinemann is a provider of resources written by real teachers for real classrooms. Heinemann values teachers as decision makers and students as curious learners. Discover the path to lifelong professional learning at Heinemann.com. Heinemann is dedicated to teachers. I'm Brett from Heinemann. Today on the Heinemann Podcast, empathy. In Sara Ahmed's book, Being the Change, she writes about how empathy has become a buzzword, and its practice tends to get lost under high achievement goals. And in their book, Kids First from Day One, Hertz and Kristi Mraz write, "You think that being an empathetic teacher is just part of the gig, but in the heat of the moment and the stress of the job, it's easy to want kids to see it from our point of view rather than to see it from theirs. Yes, empathy is a feel-good idea, but there's a lot more to it than that." In today's podcast, we've brought together authors Sara Ahmed, Hertz and Kristi Mraz to discuss empathy not as something we have, but rather as an ongoing daily practice that must be prioritized in our minds and actions. Our conversation begins with keeping empathy focused on the kids. So, Sara, where you start to write about empathy is sort of almost a perfect companion to where Kristi and Kristine start to write about empathy. Sara, you start off by saying how it's really written into mission statements, but then it's not really always acted upon, and it just sort of becomes a buzzword. And you both really, all three of you really hit on this idea that empathy needs to stay focused on the kids and that you have to do the work yourself. And it's really about perspective and it's about point of view. So it seems as though people have a hard time sort of even defining or understanding clearly what empathy is when they're so busy kind of making it a buzzword.
Yeah, no, for sure. I marked those pages in our books too, and you guys have it on 8, and I have it on XS 111. But I underlined something in your book. I was just looking at some of the parallels, and you guys both wrote about it. It's the last sentence of your first paragraph and under the empathetic teacher. And it just says, empathy is a feel-good idea, but there's more to it than that. Teresa Wiseman, am I saying that correctly? Her 4 attributes of empathy is what you guys go into in the toolkit. Because I started thinking about the differences and the parallels to the age with kids in kindergarten, first and second grade, and then middle school and high school, and what those 4 attributes look like.
Teresa Wiseman has these 4 different attributes of, it's almost like a how-to with empathy. And we thought about this when you're in one of those moments with a student in your class where you're trying to connect. And so first step that she has is to take their perspective. And so really try to imagine what it must feel like. And for younger students, it often means like physically getting down to where they are and being able to look into their eyes. And then asking them to say more about what's happening. And so instead of rushing to judgment, which is so easy to do as a teacher, to think like, no, the fact that your favorite pen just ran out of ink isn't a big deal. We got to get going. It's time for PE. To really honor the fact that for young children, some seemingly small things are actually big in their world. And for older students, some things that we might dismiss because we've seen it 100 times, like a fight with a best friend at recess or trying to negotiate a triad of friends. Again, in their lives and in their world, these are huge milestone moments. And so once you have used that judgment and not judge them rather, then, going to and recognizing the emotions, which touches on a lot of the whole brain child work by Daniel Siegel, talking about like making it more of a narrative to help them connect and work through those emotions. And then, saying that this happens, let's make a plan for moving forward and communicating and connecting. Those are kind of like 4 quick how to use empathy in the moment. And that I think we've both started to use them more and more with young children.
Yeah, I was looking at them and then I started wondering about my own writing, and I was thinking, God, am I contradicting this when I'm talking? Because I started thinking about, I'm thinking about my own middle school experiences and then what I used to do to kids by just being like, put yourself in their shoes, like almost without listening first, like put yourself in their shoes, like how would you feel? And I have been quoted probably now saying like, you can't just ask kids to like put themselves in people's shoes without sort of all of this work and the process and the background, right? So I can't just say, put yourself in someone else's shoes. And now I'm asking even adults like to sort of, without getting proximate, like you can't do that, right? So getting putting yourself in someone else's shoes is getting like one step closer to proximate. Reading a book is like getting one step closer to proximate. And so I love this framework that you have in here, and even the language that you guys use. It's helping me working in an elementary school now, because I've also, mostly been used to just working with middle school kids.
Well, I just think that's such a good point that you're making, Sarah, about it is so easy. And we actually had to like do a little bit of like, we've been kind of revising how we've been talking about empathy too, because part of what I thought was empathy turns out to be conversational narcissism, which we just learned about. And a shout out to your tweet again, the one that made me sit back when you said people don't listen, they just wait to talk. And I was thinking about, I thought about that. It fits really well with conversational narcissism, which I used to masquerade as empathy for me, because I'd be like, I totally know how you feel. Right. Here's my story about it. And I was just in a situation with a teacher who's like, well, the way that I use empathy with my kids is I'm like, I know when I'm in your situation, I do X, Y, Z. And that's such a go-to for me too, but that's not actually empathy, because you're missing that step, that fancy word you're saying, proximate.
Well, that came to me about like that sort of listen to like don't wait to talk, is because, middle school kids will just tell you basically right in the middle of your response to like, shut up. Like if they're telling you something, so like I started reframing the way I was saying it, because I would do that. I would say like, oh yeah, I remember this with my friend in like middle school. And like one of my kids was literally like, basically she said, can I finish? Let me just tell you the story. So then I started trying to like reframe things like, when you're coming to me with this, do you want me to just listen to the whole thing and then like ask you questions or find connection with you or give you my thoughts? Or do you want me to just like be quiet and listen, right? I'm sort of giving them the ownership of the conversation there.
I think that if we could revise this section of the book right now, which unfortunately we can't, I think we might switch to say that we use the phrase me too, which is loaded in a different way now too. But I think we would also talk about how you can connect and really make a person feel heard without using that conversational narcissism, and that feeling like this is a human experience can be developed by asking questions and by asking them to say more about their own moment. And there's more to connection just than to saying, yeah, I have the exact same thing going on in my life.
You do talk about it though. I mean, you do say like you're sort of getting proximate, as I think you guys say something like getting down, like kind of on their level. You do that, the whole body listening thing, right? Like getting down on their level and like doing that. And that I think non-verbally signals to kids. I've had to do a lot more like getting down on one knee just in terms of height, and that actually, and it's true, it changes everything, as opposed to like me towering over like a 4 or 5 year old. And so
Sorry, when you were talking to middle schoolers and they're like, can I finish? One of the things that I was like asking myself, I wasn't just waiting to talk, I was listening and thinking about how sometimes it's like, how do you know you're actually listening? In Mindset for Learning, we talk a little bit about these like 3 conversational moves people make that are like, you think you're having a conversation, but you're actually not. And it's from this book called How to Stay Sane. It's like, you can interact by people in a me way, which is like, I like this, so you'll like this. And then there's like a me, and then like I control you. So like, I want you to do this, so I'm going to do this because I think I can control your actions that way. And then there's me ghost, which is like, I'm talking to you, you're like someone I've met before. So like, oh, you're just like so-and-so. Sometimes I think that's where like, it's easy to get a little lost, right? Like we listen enough with kids to like almost just like get the gist, like, oh, this sounds like a problem that like so-and-so had. So let me just like try to talk you through the same way. Or like, I really need you to get to lunch right now. So I'm going to say the thing that I'm going to get you there, as opposed to actually listening and accepting when like kids, like I just was talking about how a kid once was like, you're so annoying. And I was like so deeply offended that anyone could consider me annoying. And then when I was talking to someone about it, they were like, well, were you annoying? And I was like, kind of, but like I don't know. I am talking around the fact that actually listening, you have to do a couple of things. You have to like clear your mind of everyone who came before you and clear your mind of yourself. So when a kid's like, can I finish? Or like, you're so annoying. Your empathy doesn't shut down because you're like in self-preservation.
Yeah, no, for sure. And then later we both talk about this. The hardest times this is in your classroom, like things are moving, things are shuffling. You're trying to get this done when things are like heated or difficult. Currently, every day, if you watch the news, things are heated and difficult, you know, or when you're talking about it with kids, but then when it transfers like out of the classroom, we're asking kids to like sort of use these strategies as they go out the door. Like, then like, where does that toolkit of empathy go? Things are heated in conversation, or there's controversy in like whatever media we're reading or listening to. I guess with kids, then whatever we're modeling for them is like hopefully the things that they're taking out, right? So like checking their bias, like the kid who told you you were annoying, like, you know, your very kind friend saying, well, were you? Right? Because they're asking you to sort of like pause and reflect on that, asking questions and actually like admitting you don't know, and sort of willing to like step up to this like learning stance, as opposed to being like, oh yeah, I know, I've been paying attention to this. It is like in our vision statements and mission statements, and it's like on all these banners and like colorful character posters all over school. But like, that's not necessarily the message that kids are getting from us as adults.
Well, and Sarah, you actually juxtaposed that with a 2014 study where it said 80% of students ranked achievement and happiness over concern for others. And I thought that was kind of an interesting juxtaposition, because while you're saying we're putting the mission statements, it's not making its way to the kids.
That was Harvard Graduate School of Ed, and they did that Making Caring Common project. So this study was something like the children we were meant to raise or something. And it was about the real messages that adults were sending. So it was like 10,000 kids across every type of school. And they ranked achieving over happiness. And they also ranked like hard work over fairness, right? And so the irony is like care and like fairness and empathy and compassion are like written all over these things that we have like surrounding these kids, but they're getting a mixed message because that's not what we're living. Because what's driving our days, like scores and levels and data and awards and rankings and grades. And this time of year, especially, we're thinking about all of that, you know, admissions. And so like, why is a kid going to respond on a survey like that? Like, oh God, yeah, I really do value caring over others and happiness. But meanwhile, I have to get into this school with this number and I'm at this level and I'm a red or I'm a blue or I'm a 18. I'm not a nice kid. Like, no, you know, we don't always talk about kids that way.
I'm absolutely fascinated by this conversational narcissism, and a little scared that I've probably done it a lot myself. So I kind of want to come back to it just a little bit and just wonder, Sarah, you mentioned specifically about, you know, being busy, and Kristi, you mentioned trying to get kids out the door at a certain hour and sort of recognizing it. So how do we stop in the moment, or can we, to recognize we're being conversationally narcissistic, or not recognizing the fact that we should be more empathetic in this moment and also be modeling that empathy and also be teaching that empathy? How do we monitor that in ourselves?
Essentially, conversational narcissism shifts the focus of the conversation back on the person. So the way it goes is like having a really bad day. Oh, I'm sorry. So am I. Or like, really? Oh, me too. Like, I make that move in texts all the time where I'm like, you're having a bad day. I'm going to tell you about my bad day so you don't feel as bad about your bad day. One of the examples was like, my shoes are killing me or something. And the other person being like, oh God, I know, me too. My shoes are like the worst. You know, like, do you know that like move like we make in conversations? And the idea is that you don't move away, you support whatever they say. But what's weird is like when someone's like, oh, my shoes hurt. I don't know why it feels so weird to be like, oh, I'm so sorry. Tell me about why. Like, what could you do to make it better? Or like, you know, like,
I know, like you like want to one up their foot pain or something.
Or by like saying like, oh my gosh, me too. That's like, oh, we all have hurt feet.
I know. I don't know why it feels like that either. Kristine, any thoughts about?
Yeah, I think that it was probably rooted in like a place of wanting to connect and wanting to say like, I know how you feel. You're not alone in this. Like, this is part of the human experience. I've been there too. And so I don't think that it's necessarily rooted in a bad place, but I just think that it's a bad pattern and a bad habit. And I agree that I have definitely been this person. And this was a huge eye-opener when I read it. But Kristi wrote a really great blog post about what this looks like in the classroom, and not just in the language we use, but also in the broader sense of empathy when we're thinking about how we make plans and how we respond when a child says, I need more time, or what kind of responsive curriculum we're using. And so I think that it's really easy to constantly be thinking that we're doing the right thing by trying to connect and trying to be supportive and do all these things. But in the end, it sometimes is just the shift response is just doesn't make the person feel like they've been heard as much as a more supportive response.
I'm sorry, I'm writing like everything Kristine's saying.
There's also, it seems like there's a book that we should read called We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter by Celeste Headley. That seems like it would be an interesting thing to dive more into as well.
That's a trend in literature now. The We Need to Talk, the difficult conversations one is now in its like 10th or something, 11th print. There's one called Crucial Conversations. You know, it's like all over. It's because like none of us know how to have conversations with each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I feel like that's why, well, sorry, just to give another shout out to your book. That's why your book is so helpful. We all think that we're showing empathy when we're saying like, I hear you. That like that alone, it's like surface. It's like I heard them, therefore I demonstrate empathy. But like, how do you actually understand where someone's coming? I mean, I think that's like, you know, when you're reading, one of the things kids have to start doing is text it harder. Is like when it says like so and so is walking down the street, you can't picture your own street. You know, you have to picture the street of the character, and that's like a really big jump for some kids because you'll be like, what does that street look like to you? And they like describe the street they live on as opposed to the street in the story. And I think that's like people have empathy that on their street. I think what your book does is like helps you be like, there's other streets. Here's how to see them.
Sarah, this feels like a really good time to sort of reintroduce the concept you wrote about social comprehension. This feels like a good way to kind of connect that.
It actually, when Kristi's talking about just the reading, I'm thinking about empathy as like a process and not a product. And so when I was writing about this idea about social comprehension, I was like, okay, so here we are like ingrained in like this learning and studying and teaching of all these reading comprehension strategies, and kids are constantly, you know, we're asking them to make connections and synthesize and ask questions along the way. And so then there's these other pieces about when you're out in the world, and like Kristin Zumke talks about reading the world, when you're out there reading the world, like this is a process too of comprehension strategies and skills, right? So they're just social comprehension strategies where I'm out and I'm observing my world. I'm looking at myself in this world and how that actually instructs and sort of defines the way I see others, and the way I respond to the world around me. So like, again, like I think I talk about this in the book, or I said it in a podcast, but a lot of teachers, you'll hear people do this, like, oh, I got this book because empathy, or I got this book for empathy, or things like that. And like, yes, in a way, like the doors and windows and mirrors thing is absolutely so important for kids, in addition to this process of empathy and getting proximate. And like, empathy is not like this causation thing where like, you know, you read a book and like empathy spits out. You still have to go through all those processes that you do when you're reading a book, like Kristi's talking about, right? And so you're comprehending along the way. And I think the most important thing lies in the fact that you have to be a little bit vulnerable to ask questions. Yeah, a book that I just finished reading, The Girl from Aleppo. Have any of you guys read that?
No, not yet.
So it's about a teenage girl, Nugene, who she's in a wheelchair because of a condition she was born with, and she has never left the house ever up to her teenage life. And she had to leave Aleppo, and that was the first time she left the house, was to become a refugee and like travel 9 countries and like months. And her sister was basically like pushing her. But like, as much as you feel for refugees and you're reading this media and all this news about refugees and you're seeing the tweets and you're seeing the images, I could not actually feel until I read her words, writing her story, right? And that's why I think this whole Own Voices movement is so important. Like, this was not a BBC reporter reporting on Nugene. This was her writing her story about her travel and her experience as a refugee. I'm going off on a tangent about that, but I just couldn't, I didn't feel proximate until I listened to her and read her. So that's sort of where I'm at with social comprehension. I have my feelings and thoughts about refugees and immigration in the US and other countries in the world, but like, I didn't get proximate until I got to read her story and hear her talk about her story.
That story brings up something that I read recently that I kind of wanted to forget about and close the tab and not look at anymore. And that was that researchers have been studying social ostracization and what the physical, visceral effects are if you feel like you're, not in a community, that you're like, you don't have a sense of belonging. And we're probably not the right ones to talk about all the neuroscience of empathy, but I find that fascinating as well, with the fact that we're kind of wired for connection and belonging and have mirror neurons. Anyway, one thing that they were talking about is that you're more likely to have empathy for your community, whether that's your classroom community that you've built or, a broader community. And that was both, reassuring that it's great that we're doing all this work to build community, but it was also terrifying that without a social toolkit or without this social comprehension instruction, it leaves some big gaps for not having empathy for other people. And so I think really taking that head on and giving students tools and giving ourselves tools makes it even more important.
Yeah, so I just want to keep reminding myself that I have to look at it as a process, like with kids, right? You're constantly working toward a sense of empathy. Not I don't know what it is like to be a refugee. I cannot put myself in her shoes. I just cannot do it. But I can, through reading her words, I'm in that process. It's not a product that I'm coming out with as a result of reading her book.
I think talking about it as a process makes a lot of sense in terms of A, you're never done with it, but B, you can never actually be empathetic towards everyone ever. But in knowing that it's a process, you'll always strive towards it. It's just such a shift of mindset. I mean, I think that's also a forgiving way to look at it as well, which is that because it's a process, you're constantly refining and cycling back and striving towards it. The same way that if a growth mindset is believing your skills can be developed, is an empathy mindset the one that I believe the skill can constantly be developed.
Do you guys think there's ever a time in someone's life where that ship has sailed at an age in life? They can no longer go through that process, go on that journey?
Well, I have to say this thing from How to Stay Sane. The author talks about how they found that people who aren't used to hearing good news don't develop the neural pathways to process good news, which doesn't mean you can't. It just means you have to intentionally process good news out loud and often in order to learn how to do it repeatedly. It's if I wanted to learn how to play the violin, there has to be intentional practice. And I would have to imagine that if empathy has its own set of neural pieces, I think everyone could develop it, but it's you have to have the moment where you're I'm working on developing this. And that's the part where I'm I don't know if everyone's on board with that idea.
So something that Christine and Kristi, you both write about in the toolkit that you have on empathy in the book, time is the very first thing in the toolkit. And that feels like a really important thing to sort of focus on, how everything that you've all talked about, Sarah, you kind of mentioned it can kind of sort of feel a little overwhelming in some cases if you're not careful, but small moves, big moves, things that take time, we have to be patient with ourselves. How important are these things in terms of how we approach it, in terms of not sort of jumping into it all at once or making it manageable?
It seems odd to have to justify why we need empathy for each other, but I feel that's the outgrowth of not having it. We think, I can teach kids to have this thing that I'm not practicing, but the implicit messages you're sending all the time about cutting up a kid's story or having the answer before, or telling a kid the thing they're worried about they shouldn't be worried about. All those little moves we make from a good place of trying to be I'm trying to make the day run, I'm trying to help this kid, is sending those dual messages. So I think just waking up and having your thesis statement, today I will work on my process of empathy and I'm going to reflect on the moments at the end of the day, is it has to be prioritized in our mind for it to also bleed into our actions.
When you guys do that, I was actually having a coaching conversation with a teacher at school last week, and I opened up to your schedules that you have, the schedule examples in there. And I basically said, look at the empathy for the kids in this schedule, understanding of the kids' feelings and perspectives throughout the day. You guys talk about it all the time, that kids should be moving all the time, how we should create the space for them. But even in your schedule, right, it's not this human story, but there is a human story that lives through that every single day, right? There's 28 of them, or 35 of them, or 60 if you're in certain districts in our state, and so, or in our country. And so I think it's more, but I don't know if this is what you were talking about, but creating time, yes, but then your time, your whole day with kids is that responsiveness to that process of empathy with the kids, because you're actually creating time through your structured and unstructured time with them. to have those moments. I've been doing a little bit more thinking. Kristine, you brought up about like the neuroscience behind it and being more empathetic towards people in your community, which is true, right? We often respond positively to people in our community. And for a lot of folks, that means people that look only like you. And so that's why I talk a little bit about echo chambers, because my community at school now is sort of globally international, diverse community by numbers. You have to think about actually what empathy looks like. I'm in the space right now. Not everyone needs to be, but I am. And I'm looking at empathy sort of cross-culturally. There's this journal, Cross-Cultural Psychology, that did a study on empathy across 63 countries. It was fascinating to me because they talked about the fact that empathy relies on collectivism and agreeableness and like how conscientious the society is and personal self-esteem, and then sort of the pro-social behaviors of that country, meaning like volunteering and donations. I can't remember when the study was from. It was from a few years ago, but you know, the number one country on that list was Ecuador. And I was like, well, I want to go to Ecuador. I want to see what they're doing in Ecuador, you know, to make it. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because we had a International Women's Day celebrated at school not too long ago. And, you know, the girls are out there like rocking their stickers and their T-shirts. The guys are too. And a couple of the boys were talking to my soccer players, and the girls came running up to me during lunch and they were like, oh, Miss Sarah, the boys keep asking like why we have International Women's Day and like when's Boys International Day and stuff like that. And you know, you kind of want to quip like, well, because every day is Guys Day, you know, like, and things like that when kids come up to you, if you're feeling sort of that it's snarky about it. But you almost want to catch the kids in like that act of noticing and observing, you know, and like how Brett started talking about time, but like helping to take that question and those thoughts to like reframe their questions, like taking time in your class to do that. That's a conversation just like on the periphery that you can take back into your classroom and like maybe reframe it from when is, you know, International Boys Day or International Men's Day to like, why is there even a need for International Women's Day or Women's Month or Black History Month and like all of these things. That's where I stand with time. I think you have to sort of make the time for it, especially when things like that pop up in your day.
Well, and in the early childhood setting, one of the things that I think makes it a little bit easier is that the social studies curriculum is basically like you and your family, and your community, especially like when you watch kids at play and stuff, you hear those questions like being played out, you know, as they're trying to negotiate, like, you know, who gets to drive the car, or, you know, and a kid will be like, well, dads drive, right? Or like kids who are like, no, you have to have parents. You can't live with anyone but parents. I think even before time comes the soft landing position that I think your book helps people face a little bit better, which is that like the questions are going to be difficult and it's going to feel uncomfortable. It is the process of like, this child said something about how you have to have a dad in a family, right? Rather than just shushing or being like, you know, no.
Right.
That's not how you develop empathy. And I think the bigger work that comes out in some of your work, Sarah, is like, it's a replicable process. When I encounter something that's new to me, how do I learn a way to respond to that? That's like with an sort of like an open stance as opposed to a different bad stance, you know?
You know, we're talking about the process of empathy, and Kristi and I have also been talking a little bit post publication date about different types of empathy, and it seems just like it's a hard time to be in this world, and they're hard conversations, and we've learned more and more about, like, you know, there's emotional empathy where you're really feeling like you emotionally are feeling the same feelings. And I know that when you do that in a classroom of 20 or 30 or 60 students, and it's just so physically draining day after day, and especially in our world as we are right now. And then we think about cognitive empathy, which I think leads us to a lot of that dismissal and thinking about like, okay, well, yeah, I get it, but you know, I'm not going to really go there and conceptualize that feeling, but I can't approximate, if I'm using that word correctly. And so then as a teacher, I think a lot about trying to build some compassionate empathy. And so I can connect, I can venture down the emotional road a little bit, but not completely be drawn in. And because I think that this is in the world of education and the world that we live in, I think this process of building empathy and reflecting on your empathy is really important. But I think we also need to give ourselves and students tools for making it a long process and a sustainable process as well.
My thanks to Sarah Ahmed, Christine Hertz, and Kristi Mraz for their time today. You can learn about their books, Being the Change by Sarah Ahmed and Kids First from Day One by Christine Hertz and Kristi Mraz by visiting Heinemann.com. And while you're there, visit the Heinemann blog where you can find video interviews with the authors, more podcasts from them, as well as sample chapters and study guides of their books as well. Be sure to follow all three of them on Twitter. Sarah can be found at Sara K. Ahmed. Christine is at Christine_Hertz, and Kristi is at Mraz Christine, with a K. We'd love for you to comment and review the Heinemann podcast so more educators can discover it. You can also follow Heinemann on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, as well as our various Facebook groups. Plus, you can get a daily teacher tip right on your phone directly from Heinemann authors by downloading the Heinemann Teacher Tip app. All this and more on Heinemann.com. Thanks for listening.